Hello. So before I get into the main traction of the video, you'll excuse me if I just make a quick word about some news there's been today, and that is that the former Speaker of the House of Commons, Michael Martin, has passed away at the age of 72. Speaker Martin was in his tenure from 2000 to 2009, and he had to resign on unfortunate circumstances because of his handling of the expenses case, um, the expenses scandal. Truthfully, he's not going to go down as one of the great speakers, but I always found him to be a thoughtful man. I always thought he was quite considerate in his language. If not a particularly strong speaker, he was certainly thoughtful. And my condolences to his family. He certainly left his mark on the history of the Commons. Now, what I want to talk about is the the world of journalism. Now, everything I want to say will not be able to be covered in one video because of the space issue on my computer. I have time limits of roughly 10 minutes, which is maybe a good thing because I do tend to talk a lot anyway. So maybe it's going to force me to have some more discipline in that regard. I want to talk about just the nature of journalism and the difficulty that journalists face, and also criticism of journalists, where that's valid, where it's not valid. Let me start by saying it's easy to forget that journalists have a very difficult job. This is something that perhaps sometimes is forgotten. The same as politicians have a difficult job, and that's often overlooked because people get so wound up with criticising a particular person or playing party politics that they forget actually everyone in that role. They're constantly under the microscope, ironically by journalists. Then, of course, you have crossovers like Michael Gove, who was a former journalist, became a politician. Like I said, I'm not going to be able to cover everything I want to here, but I do think it is worth mentioning a little bit because there is a lot of very, very, very important questions about the power of the press and international comparisons and so on. Last year, the campaigning group, the charity Reporters Without Borders, because they act in both capacities, um, revealed that the five most dangerous countries for journalists were Syria, followed by Mexico, followed by Iraq, followed by Afghanistan, followed by South Sudan. Now, none of that surprising. All five countries are facing bloody conflicts. Mexico is a little different from the others in the sense that it isn't the whole country in a state of war, but particular states are worse than others. And needless to say, there has been a very bloody drug war going on there. Um, and in any given year, probably dozens of journalists are killed. Journalists, press personnel, photographers are killed just trying to do their job. So we should never ever lose sight of that. Jeremy Corbyn, to his credit, and it's not often I commend Jeremy Corbyn, but I will give him credit for this. Even despite all the personal criticism he'd faced, he did point out that journalists often around the world face great personal danger. So this was when he was having there was a dispute going on about the press's coverage of Corbyn and etc. I'll give Corbyn his due for pointing that out because it is true. Um, so it's very important that those of us who are critical of the press, that is to say, critical of particular networks, we don't lose sight of the fact that journalists on the ground, regardless of which network they represent, they all face dangers. I mean, I actually studied journalism at university, journalism and editorial design at the University of Wolverhampton. Things didn't quite work out, and that's, I guess, you could say, one of my life's main regrets. I always kind of pictured myself as a frontline journalist. It's probably never going to happen now. And I admit that's one of my life's big regrets. I remember reading books, biographies of Kate Adie, who's a well-known now retired BBC journalist. She covered Tiananmen Square protests. She was born here in Sunderland. Gavin Hewitt, Martin Bell, Jon Snow. Big names in journalism in this country. And I found those books fascinating, just their insight into the sort of situations they faced. Yes, there was danger, but also a lot of complexities. They really had to be very careful about the things they said. They sometimes had to tell white lies in order to get access to do interviews. There was all sorts of intrigues in those books that are very revealing. Um, and this is the thing about journalism. Of course, it's dangerous. If you're reporting from a war zone, even if you're wearing the press, um, a press vest, there's still dangers there, and sometimes certain combatants don't even care. Journalists are brave people, and they face a very difficult job, and it's something we should, never overlook. They step out there, and unlike soldiers, they're not armed, so they're very brave people, and I don't think we should overlook that. And it isn't just from a point of physical danger. There's also it can be a very pressurizing job. It can be a very emotional job. You know, they have to record history, sometimes very upsetting things, and they have to keep a certain professional distance. Um, there has been a tendency in recent years for journalists to deliberately to divorce themselves from that argument of cover the story, don't be part of it. I think Christian Amanpour on CNN said, "We insist on being truthful, not neutral." I think what she was driving at is that if you see upsetting things, you're human. You cannot not be emotional. And I suppose you don't want a situation where journalists are robots. You know, there's huge variation in what I would consider to be professional levels of journalistic style. One thing I really don't like is when a journalist is reading a serious story, let's say some massacre in a war zone, or some particularly serious crime story or whatever, and they've got a big beaming smile across their face, or they just can't deliver the story with a degree of, the tone that's necessary for that particular story. I find it astonishing how certain journalists are so sloppy in their delivery. Having said that, others are very professional and they deliver it in the. I mean, one of the best journalists around at the moment, just off the top of my head, Clive Myrie on the BBC. I think he's a very capable, very professional journalist, and he delivers stories with the professionalism you would expect of a big organisation like the BBC. The BBC, of course, is no stranger to criticism, but Clive Myrie, in my opinion, is one of many examples of individually good journalists. As an organisation, it deserves a lot of criticism, but has produced some great journalists over the years, and he's one of them. Um, I think that the issue of media bias is a profound question. I'm not going to be able to cover everything in one video, but it is a very profound question. Media accountability is a very profound question, and whilst I absolutely do believe that journalists deserve respect for the difficulty of their work, they should also remember that when they're representing a big organisation, there is valid the question of accountability is also very important. It's not necessarily their fault as frontline journalists doing their best in difficult circumstances. It sometimes comes down to editors back in the studio in London or Washington or Moscow or back in the studios. But on the ground, those sort of journalists certainly deserve respect. And like I said, it isn't just about physical danger. You get situations where journalists get harassed, they get imprisoned. Turkey has a shameful record of imprisoning more journalists, professional journalists, than any other country in the world. That's shameful, and a good reason why Turkey should not be allowed to join the EU as long as this continues. Under Erdogan, civic liberty in Turkey is greatly eroded. It's basically become a dictatorship, and I think that's utterly disgraceful. Egypt's also got a pretty bad record on its treatment of journalists. In fact, to be honest, Arab countries, thinking of Egypt, Arab countries in general have a very bad record. According to Reporters Without Borders, the worst, no surprise here, is Syria. The best, and this is, comparatively speaking, is Mauritania. Um, but that still is quite low in the world rankings. But, authoritarian governments the world over fear independent journalists. That is why an independent press really is sacred. and it is absolutely critical for a democracy. You need an independent press to hold the powerful to account, not just the government, also the judicial system, also anyone in a position of power. But the caveat to that, and this is an important caveat, is that the media as a structure is also powerful and they also need to be held to account. In my view, in a democracy, everybody in a powerful position, whether that be politicians or judges or leading journalists, newspaper editors, they all need to be accountable. Now, I would argue, for example, politicians are under far more personal scrutiny